I'm Cindy Kelly, Atomic Heritage Foundation, and it is Thursday, July 17, 2014, and I'm in the lovely home of Vera Kistikowski. And the first question I have for Vera is to tell me your name and spell it.
It's Vera Kistikowski, and the last name is Kistiakowsky, and the reason that the spelling doesn't match the pronunciation that I gave it is because my father, after fighting against the Bolsheviks, ended up in Berlin, and there his name was spelt for the first time in the alphabet that we use. And in Germany, the Russian V or F sound gets a W. And so I now have a name that phonetically would be Kistiakowski, but that's not the original pronunciation.
You know, maybe you can tell us when you were born and where, and of course about your parents.
I was born in Princeton, New Jersey, where my father was, I think at the time he was a research associate at Princeton. And my mother had come from Germany. They had met in Berlin while he was studying there. And she got an immigration visa and followed him, and her family had notified an uncle who was in the States that she was coming, and he was there at the pier to make sure that the first thing that happened was that she and my father got married. And so they were married and set up in a small half of a house in Princeton, and I was born, I guess, a couple of years later in 1928.
Great. So what was your mother's name?
Hildegard Möbius. If you want to know the full truth, it was Anna-Marie Margareta Hildegard Möbius.
And what kind of family background does she have?
Her father was the pastor of the Lutheran Church in Goslar, and as such he was what would be in the Episcopal system a bishop of an area. He had a wide spread of direction over surrounding parishes. And he and his wife had 6 children, of whom my mother was I think the second child, and certainly the second girl child.
And was she, what was she doing in Berlin?
She had been studying in Berlin before. She was going to be an MD, and this was a time when women did not go into medicine, but she had gone through gymnasium and was going to go to the university and get a medical degree. But then the war intervened, and she became a technician in a medical lab for the units that went out and supported the people who helped the wounded soldiers directly on the front lines. Well, not on the front lines, but just behind the front lines. And after the war, Germany was plunged into this depression. Well, no, actually it was an inflation of the currency that accompanied it. And she suffered from typhus and malnutrition. And finally her family sent her to Sweden, where they knew some people who fed her back into being a healthy woman. And she came back and went back to Berlin to pick up studies, but decided at that point that she wouldn't go into medicine, would instead go into physical therapy, which was a much shorter, easier course. And my father went to Berlin. He had fought with the White Army against the Bolsheviks, and then been evacuated with the last of the White Army to Turkey, where he had been interned by the British, and finally managed to ease his way out of the internment camp, thanks to an understanding officer there. And wended his way to Ruthenia, where he worked as a glass inlayer. But he was in contact with an uncle in Paris who had gotten out of Russia with substantial portions of his fortune intact in the form of gems sewed into his clothes, and set up business as a lawyer. He was a lawyer in Paris, and that's my uncle Igor, from whom I have the paintings that hang on the wall here. And he staked my father to an education at the University of Berlin, and sent him money so he could get there. And so my father went to Berlin and did both his undergraduate work. His mother he was still in contact with his mother, and she sent him papers proving that he had completed gymnasium, which he had not. He had left after 1.5 years short of completing gymnasium to fight, because the Bolsheviks were about to attack Kiev, and there was an immediate emergency. And so he had the papers, he had the funding, and so the university took him. He did the undergraduate work that was required, passed the exams, and it was a very different kind of system from the system that we know in the United States, and it's basically possible to do it by a good deal of self-study and passing exams. And then he was matriculated and could apply for a graduate student position to get his PhD, which was the thing that he wanted to do. And he found that very few professors were willing to take a Russian. There were a flood of white Russians who had come to Paris, and they were not viewed with great favor. But one man that Father approached was Professor Bonhoeffer, and he had been in the cohort of an uncle of my father. They both had been scientists together at Berlin, and he had fond memories of Alexander Kistiakowsky. And so he took my father on, and from there on it was just upward and onward.
But they were in Paris, or he had already left Paris and was in Berlin when the Bonhoeffer connection was made?
Oh, he was in Berlin.
In Berlin.
Later on he moved to Paris.
I see. Yeah. So what was his father's name?
My father's name?
Well, why don't you tell us, because I don't think you've mentioned your father's name yet.
My father is George Bogdanovich Kistiakowsky. He dropped the Bogdanovich in the United States, and he was George Bogdan Kistiakowsky. But the Russian form says he's son of Bogdan. And his father was a very interesting man that I could spend hours talking about, but I won't.
We'll have to read
he
your
was
book.
also, I won't say it, he was considered by the Tsar to be an undesirable person because of his political views. So it took a long while for him to achieve a professorship. Actually, he didn't become a professor until the Tsar had, what does the Tsar do? He doesn't resign, he abdicates until the Tsar had abdicated. And then he was offered a professorship at the University of Kiev and took it.
So this is a long line of academics.
Yes, his father was also an academic, Alexander Kistiakovsky, and before that it had been not a family of academics. It started with an illegitimate son of a Cossack maiden and named Kistiakovsky, and the master of the estate, who became the, when he grew up, he was still a serf, but he became the estate manager. And when the master died, in his will it was stated that this great-great-grandfather would be free and his family would also be free. So their children could go and get educated in the church system. They couldn't immediately go to the state system because they were the children of serfs, but their children could go into the state system and get a university education.
All right, why don't we pick up your story in, what year would it be, when your parents came to New York? What year was that?
My father came in 1925, no, it was January 1926, and my mother came, I think, essentially a year later. Maybe I may be off by a year there, but you know, it's in that ballpark. Mm-hmm. And I was born in 1928, and in 1930 he accepted an offer from Conant to come to Harvard and be an assistant professor. And my father didn't accept the offer until Conant gave him the guarantee that he wanted, namely that he had 3 years as an assistant professor, and then he would either be promoted to tenure or he would be out. Because Harvard at that time had a very bad habit of keeping assistant professors indefinitely. So he did prodigious work and established an excellent scientific reputation, published like crazy, and was promoted to associate professor with tenure after 3 years. And he became a full professor by the time he was 48. In 1948, he was born in 1900, and he also became a member of the National Academy of Sciences in 1948. And this is pretty good for somebody who spoke broken English at a very risible level when he first arrived at Princeton. And he enjoyed very much the work at Harvard. I mean, he really enjoyed the freedom, you know, the interaction with colleagues of all kinds. I have a very interesting tape of a discussion with John Kenneth Galbraith about their talks together in the early, that would have been the early 30s, and about the Depression and the problems in the United States.
So he was a polymath.
He was interested in it, but you know, I wouldn't say he was an expert then. But anyway, then things started to come apart in Europe again, and I should have brought my chronology. I'm going to have trouble with the dates. See, Poland was invaded in '39, right? Yes. That, I think, is when really the United States started to do something about preparing for war at many levels. But already Conant and Bush had been talking about the fact that there was inevitably going to be a conflict and that nothing was being done to upgrade American science in the aspects of war. And so they had started something called the National Research Defense Committee, and Conant had asked my father to, let me call him George, had asked George to serve on the Explosives Committee, and then to start up an explosives laboratory in Brewston, Pennsylvania, on Bureau of Mines land, and with the help of the Bureau of Mines people. And that is how he was diverted from being a professor into the war. And in the course of that, he became an explosives expert. And I'll cut out all of the details because I have, you know, many hundreds of pages about that. And in parallel with that was the development, of course, of the idea that you could make a nuclear weapon by having a nuclear fission that was explosive. Took place so quickly that it was explosive. And people like Conant and Bush were skeptical, and there were committees of all kinds that were formed. And my father was brought in to sit on some of those committees. And at first he was very skeptical. He said, oh, it couldn't be made to work. But then after he had really thought it through, he came back to Conant and said, yes, it would work. And Conant, in his biography, said in his biography that at that time he had known it would work, and he had a complete faith in what George had told him, but he hadn't told other people so that he had a point of negotiation. And that was how George earlier became cognizant of what was going on. And he was quite happy doing the NDRC program, and I'm not going to talk about OSRD. It just gets too complicated if I talk about all of the ramifications of that wartime thing. But then they did, in fact, establish the laboratory in New Mexico to actually make weapons. And they had worked for a year. And at the laboratory were many smart young men, and one of these was Seth Nettermeyer, who came up with the idea that you could cause this explosive fission by having an implosion of material. Actually, it wasn't original with Nettermeyer. He heard one of the speakers mention an earlier suggestion that this was possible, but Nettermeyer really worked out how it could be done, and then Oppenheimer gave him a small group to try out his ideas. And the first thing that they discovered was they didn't know anything about explosives, so they went to Brewston to learn a little bit about explosives, and that was the first that George learned about what was going on there. And the work progressed, but it progressed very slowly because it was a small group and it was going in a very linear fashion. And when things didn't work, you know, if you just make a small change and it still doesn't work, it just doesn't go very quickly. And Oppenheimer became convinced that what he needed was somebody who really was an explosives expert. And Charlie Thomas, who was at a big chemical company that I will remember.
Monsanto.
What?
Monsanto?
Monsanto, thank you. Yeah. He was at that meeting, and he knew George, and he knew what George was doing because of links with NDRC. And he said, well, George Kistiakowsky is the civilian expert in explosives. And so they started to try to persuade George to go there, and he didn't want to. He did not want to be buried in an organization, and also he was thinking of maybe joining one of the teams that went to Europe to look at the what the Germans had done as following the retreating German armies. But Oppenheimer got Conant to lean on George, and so George went to Los Alamos. But he made a stipulation that he would only go if he were given adequate housing and if his daughter could come and visit him in the summer. They were divorced by then, and I was living with my mother and stepfather in Pittsburgh. My stepfather was also a physical chemist, and he also worked at Brewston. And for the record, he was a very, very sweet, forgiving man to be saddled with a teenage stepdaughter like me. But anyway, that this daughter would come, which was perfectly okay, but then be allowed to go to college and come back the next year, and that was not allowed. If you went away to college, if a child went away to school, they could not come back. I don't know why, but, and so I was the exception to that rule. And so in 1944, I went out to Los Alamos for the first summer. I was 15 going on 16, and I had just graduated from high school, and I was going to Mount Holyoke College that coming fall. and I felt very grown up until I was faced with getting through the train change in Chicago, from the train from Pittsburgh to Chicago to the Santa Fe line out to Lamy, New Mexico, where my father met me. And we went to Los Alamos, and I spent the summer months there. And he had acquired a horse. It had been loaned to him by Oppenheimer, but with the understanding that it would be returned to Oppenheimer when George left. But then Oppenheimer didn't think the horse was getting enough exercise because George was working too much and was trying to, micromanage the horse. And George offered to buy it, and the offer was accepted. So finally, he did buy Crisis. And he had also bought for me at a remount sale. It had the last cavalry unit of the United States stationed there, and that is why they had cavalry horses. And I got a Guest, who was a half-thoroughbred bay gelding, and a friend of my father's, Irma Schula, got Chess, who was a chestnut horse. I don't know. I would guess he had some thoroughbred in him, but I don't know what his lineage was.
You were 15, going on 16.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the summer of 1944?
Yes.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
So your dad picks you up at the train station,
Mm-hmm.
and then
We drove to the Los Alamos Road, which at that time was very narrow and precipitous. It had not yet been widened to its final state. So very exciting. And there were guards at the gate, and there was a tall wire fence that went all the way around the area that was populated there. And that was exciting. And then we came to the little stone house that had been given to George to live in. It had originally been the powerhouse for the ranch school that had occupied the mesa, which was the flat area on which the lab was built. Before it became a place for George to live, it had been a Red Cross center. But they then, in order so they would have something suitable for George, I should explain there was a row of houses that had belonged to the ranch school, and it was called Bathtub Row because it had that desirable feature. And all of the buildings that were built didn't. They had showers. And so this house is on Bathtub Row, but had been not really a house before. And it was, however, modified to become a very comfortable little house. It had a large living dining area with a small kitchen, a Pullman kitchen off it, and a small bedroom and a bathroom sandwiched between the bedroom and the kitchen. And this is where we lived, and I slept in the bedroom, and my father slept on a couch. I don't remember if it was a folding couch, but it probably was, or pull-out bed or something like that in the living room. And we had breakfast together there, and Sometimes, well, I don't really ever remember having lunch with him there. I think his schedule at Los Alamos wasn't that regular. But I do remember that we used to have agreements that we would meet for lunch at Fuller Lodge, which was the big recreational area and also housing area for guests, and had the best cuisine on the hill. The cuisine in the other places that you could eat, and there were two, and one was the PX, I remember, but that was fast food. And then there was a cafeteria that wasn't called the cafeteria. It had a military name because, I should add, of course, Los Alamos was a military post. It was first and foremost a military post. And that was because General Groves wanted to keep complete, total secrecy over the project. I had certain chores that I was supposed to do, but otherwise I was completely on my own. Father went to work in the morning and he came home after work, and we had supper or went riding or whatever. And it was glorious. For the first time in my life, I did not have somebody who was telling me what to do. And I could go riding by myself. And I had all kinds of wonderful adventures until two things happened. I once was very late for lunch, so late that I rode my horse up onto the lawn at Fuller Lodge, where my very grumpy father was sitting at a table, and said I was very sorry I had gone so far I couldn't get back in time. And another time when one of the people at the stables, they were soldiers who were taking care of the horses, complained to my father that I was bringing my horse in hot, and that I really should be told not to do that. So the law was laid down that I could not go out further than making it possible for me to return in time, and that had to involve time to walk the horse at the end, not come galloping home and being okay. And that was a small crimp in my explorations. But I think people got on George's case because he decided it would be nice for me to have riding companions. And there were some. The Chadwicks had twin daughters, and they were a couple years older than I was, and they liked to ride. And the Chadwicks, Mrs. Chadwick may have even initiated it. I think the wives at Los Alamos were rather scandalized at the freedom I was given, that I would ride with their daughters. My attitude was that this was a fate worse than death, to be condemned to ride with two young ladies, which I did not aspire to be. And but that was the way it was, so we did it. And unfortunately, they were used to park riding and didn't know much about trail riding, and by that time I felt myself to be an expert. So perversely, I sort of took the lead in what we did. And once, when we were taking a shortcut, which involved getting off the horses and scrambling up the side of a steep hill, one of the Chadwick sisters unfortunately put her hand where my horse put his hoof and got hurt, and that sort of diminished my reliability in the eyes of their family. And but however, after riding by myself for a while, the other Chadwick girls said, why didn't we go riding together? So we did, and her horse ran away from her. And of course, it was my fault, not her fault, but obviously I must be the villain. So that was the end of me riding with the Chadwick girls. You can see the things that I remember the most vividly. And what else? We may have gone to Indian dances or something like that, but I don't remember that, as honestly. I have been to an Indian dance, but I think that was from a much later visit, probably. So I can't tell you very much. There were parties that I was dragged to, and I didn't enjoy them and have no distinct memory of them. The only really distinct memory I have is of having Niels Bohr pointed out to me at a luncheon at Fuller Lodge by my father. And that was the one thing that approached a breach of security. Actually, it was, because he wasn't called Bohr. I forget what his pseudonym was, but all of the famous scientists had pseudonyms. But I guess it was a minor breach.
Baker, I think.
Yeah, a minor breach of security. Otherwise, my father told me nothing about what he was doing. And the summer ended, and I went home to Pittsburgh and packed up my things and went off to Mount Holyoke. And then at the end of the year, I went back to Pittsburgh, and then within 2 weeks later was on a train for Los Alamos again for the second summer. And I should have said something about Irma Schula. She was a riding companion very frequently during the first year. Very good rider, and very good, what you would call a very good sport. I mean, willing to suffer rough circumstances. We went on a trip where we camped out and slept out, and you know, she was up for things like that. Well, anyway, I came back the second year, and things were much different. For one thing, my father had found me a job. I was now going to try and finance some of my clothing needs by working at a summer job. And this was sort of the bait. If I did this job, I'd have all this money to buy clothing, because by now I was in a place where clothing counted. I mean, anybody who was anybody at Mount Holyoke had cashmere twin sets. I had never even heard of cashmere twin sets. And even though I wasn't a member of that elite collection of girls, you know, it would have been sort of nice to have one, even if it wasn't necessary. But anyway, so that was the bait. And underneath it, I sensed the fact that it was going to happen one way or another. And it turned out to be very, very nice, because I found a job with Ethel Froman, who was the wife of a physicist and who was in charge of the pharmacy at the hospital, who was a very good mentor. I mean, I was doing chemistry already. I had finished all my chemistry and physics courses in high school. And so when I was at Mount Holyoke, I had not taken the general chemistry. I had started out with qualitative and quantitative analysis. And so that was the rationale for why I could work in a pharmacy. I knew how to do those things. And she taught me, and as I say, was an excellent mentor. And it turned out to be, a very slow kind of endeavor, not exciting or anything, but a very pleasant experience, thanks to what a warm, intelligent person she was. And the only point at which there was a bit of trouble was she took a week off and told the hospital that I could do everything. And I went home proudly and told my father, and he called her up and said that the one thing I couldn't do was to hand out opiates and other things like that. Things that were really potentially dangerous. And so they had to scramble around and find a doctor who could do that. But except for that category of substance, I did all of the prescription work. And I had a horse the second summer also. It wasn't Guest's. Guest had been sold at the end of the first summer. That's too bad, because it would have been nice to have had him again. But I had an adequate horse, not in the stables where Crisis and Irma's horse Chess were, but in a barn in the field on the far end of the mountain end of the, not farm, but a pasture, mountain end of the plateau, the Los Alamos Plateau. And I think his name was Pan, but I'm not sure. But he was perfectly adequate, and I didn't have as much access to him because I was working, but it was all right. And the other thing was, my father was terrifically busy this summer of '45, trying to get the final bombs put together. So we had much less time to do things. And then one day he told me that he was going to be gone for a few days, and gave me money so that I could, buy food and, I'm sure, instructions on what to do, and disappeared. And that was all I knew about it until he came back the following day, and there was great excitement at Los Alamos, but muted, and still I was told nothing. I think everybody told their wives. He did not tell me about the Trinity test. Irma didn't either. She knew about it. She was the manager of the personnel office, but not the official boss. The official boss was somebody else, and was male, of course. But Lily Hornig, who was the wife of a young chemist there, and her husband later became presidential science advisor, Don Hornig. She was also a chemist. She had stopped her PhD work to come to Los Alamos with Don, but she did complete it after she got back. And anyway, she worked as a chemist there, and then she worked in the explosives group. And her verdict on Irma was that it took 3 people to do the job that Irma did when she was there, when Irma resigned. And so that summer was, oh, and then of course there was Hiroshima, and then I found out what had been going on. And at that time it made very little impression on me. I mean, the war had been something that had been there, and I knew it was awful. But you know, it was at an emotional remove. It was not something that was immediately awful. And same thing with that. And I must say, I have never gone to Japan and have had opportunities to do so in the course of my own work. And to this day, for some reason, I still feel a great deal of guilt for both the initial bombing and then the denial of the fact that the radiation was killing the Japanese population. For quite a number of years, the line was, oh no, nobody's dying from radiation. But anyway. And then there were parties after Japan was defeated, and there was not a party after Hiroshima. They did not party. The people who knew about the weapon just could not party about it. After the VJ Day, there was enormous relief. The war was ended. No more American soldiers would be killed. And one thing that did happen at that end of the summer, we did go into Santa Fe to Fuller Lodge and do things that we hadn't done before. More, I think, because my father was free. I mean, he no longer had this enormous pressure to deliver the first 2 plutonium bombs. I mean, he didn't do the whole bomb, he did the explosive part of it, but if you didn't get that working right, then the bomb didn't go off. And we did some more horseback riding trips, and so at the end of the summer we had some time together. And then I went back to Mount Holyoke.
How long did your dad then stay at Los Alamos?
He stayed first because Gross was telling everybody to keep on working to make a stockpile of the weapons. And so George continued to the work of making the weapons. But everybody was figuring out what they were going to do with their lives, and he was clear in what he was going to do. He was going to go back to Harvard. And in October there was the end of the military situation at Los Alamos. I don't know what the date was. I think it was October 10th or something like that. And at that time, Oppenheimer resigned, and Bradbury became the director of the laboratory. And George had already, I think, resigned and turned over the direction of X Division to who did he turn it over to? Name's gone out of the head again. But anyway, turned it over to somebody who had been working there and was very knowledgeable about it and could pick up the work and do it. And George worked on writing down exactly what they had done and basically how they had come to figuring out how to make the weapon and what the end result was. And this was a larger effort. The physicists were doing their part and metallurgists were doing their part and so on and so on. So it was a big book, and George just wrote the explosives section of it. And that went on until January, and then, oh wow, I'm leaving some crucial out. In September, George and Irma became married, and she moved into the little house, and they had gone for a honeymoon in the mountains around Santa Fe, in which she had been kicked by a horse. She was a long-suffering woman, and there had been all kinds of adventures and misadventures. My father wrote me long letters, so I have vivid descriptions of all of these things, which is why I know all this. When they came back from their honeymoon, they discovered that there was an outhouse attached to their stone house. George had asked that they build a shed to store items that they didn't need indoors because it was a very small house, and now Irma was there, it would be overcrowded with two sets of belongings. And a friend, quotation marks, had looked at this green shed and thought it was ideal for an outhouse, and had put on the usual sign that you put on an outhouse. I guess it's an opening in the door. And when you opened the door and looked inside, there was a two-seater. And the next day, George dragged this shed, that night, I guess, he dragged that shed to the lawn of the perpetrator, he thought, of the person he thought he was the perpetrator, and he got it wrong. And so it evolved into a three-cornered feud, friendly feud, but nonetheless. This is from a letter that my father wrote me on September 17th, 1955. Here is a story you will undoubtedly enjoy, even though it is mostly at my expense. Before leaving, I suggested mildly to a friend who is in charge of such things that I am tired of people walking by the windows of my house, and also that keeping all the suitcases and trunks in the bedroom is not a perfect way to live. Seemed like a good idea, since the construction personnel is idle, and here was a fine little job for them. Well, regrettably, I did not specify the details of the proposed construction, and when I returned, I found a simply formidable green wood and metal fence surrounding my place, And there, nestling against the wall by the kitchen, in the most conspicuous place, a bright green outhouse of a structure reminiscent not of trunk rooms, but of certain outhouse facilities to be found on farms. Somewhat perturbed, Irma and I went to open the door. I had a grim premonition as the door was adorned with a black paper moon looking from the distance just like a ventilation hole. And there staring at us was a rather lifelike three-header, as the farmers call it, with a little seat next to the two big ones. Irma almost gave up the ghost right there and then and went into a fit, which made me go with bowed head for 2 days. Well, putting various things together, I decided that my good Max was the perpetrator. So 2 nights later, when the Roys were peacefully sleeping, I loaded the contraption into the back of my car, drove it up to Max's house, very stealthily placed it against their wall, complete with simulated covers open and even a torn Sears and Roebuck's catalog on the side, just as in my trunk room. The next day it vanished, and today came the rest of the story. Max insists he was not the perpetrator. It appears Bradbury is the villain. So he was surprised and moved the thing himself, this time into Martha's husband's garage. That's Martha Parsons. Is this not wonderful? It seems she was today at the Bradbury house unsuspectingly complaining to his wife about the ruffians on this place, which almost closes the story. Not quite, because Max accuses me of getting the thing to his house and threatens vengeance, and I have to start thinking of getting even with Bradbury. Can you suggest something vicious but somewhat short of murdering him?
Huh.
And
That's great.
And one of the things that they had to figure out was what they were going to do with their horses. And Irma wanted to keep Chess, but George decided that he would return Red to Oppenheimer, and did so. And my horse, of course, which was a temporary arrangement, so that was no problem. And that was the end of that. And in the winter, there was an increasing problem with lack of water. The water system had run out, and George commented in a letter to me, "Our Christmas was not all Christmas should be. First, the water shortage, which continued through and is still as bad as ever. It is really a very serious nuisance, to put it mildly, when you have water only an hour every so every day and never know when it will come. The rest of the time we use water stored in the sink and a big bottle, the former for washing down the toilet by carrying over a bucket, the latter for drinking or cooking. Showers we do not take except very occasionally and surreptitiously, because no one is supposed to have them except in emergencies. The Army has not troubled to explain what constitutes an emergency worthy of a shower, and you might try to figure that one out." So
That's great.
and the people left. 1 division leader left in November, 2 in December, 3 in the first half of January, and George was the last to go. And on January 16th, he wrote his final letter to me from Los Alamos, and the next day they were off. That letter that he wrote had good news, namely that he had finally found a place to live. One of the things that was not available in the Boston area was housing, because all of the academics who had been gone for the war came flooding back. And the house that was found for him was in Harvard, Massachusetts, which at that time was a good 2-hour drive each way, so non-ideal. And that puts them on their way back to Harvard.
So what about your story? What happened? Were you influenced by, obviously, your father, but your experience at Los Alamos? Did you to pursue your career as a chemist?
Well, it was mainly my father. It had very little to do with Los Alamos. Los Alamos for me was a time of freedom, total freedom the first summer, moderated freedom the second summer. Although, as I said, I enjoyed the job with Ethel Throman. It had enough content to it that it wasn't tedious. I guess by the 20th time you make a formaldehyde solution, it gets to be a bit of a drag, but anyway. My character was pretty much not formed, but informed by a discussion I had with my father well before the Los Alamos days. We were still living in Cambridge then, so I must have been 10 years old or something like that, 11, 12. In which he told me very seriously that I should find something to do that would support me and not rely on getting married and finding somebody who would support me. This was at a time when the gospel was that all the women should go home because the boys were coming home and they would need the jobs. But that wasn't the way it was phrased at the time. It was phrased that the boys were coming home, they would be getting jobs, and of course the women would flock home, loving it, to bake cookies. And I may exaggerate. And you know, for many women, I'm sure it was true. There were many women who were doing boring jobs, and they were very happy to go home and do something where they interacted with children and other women and had that kind of a life. But I was influenced by what Father said to think always in terms of having something that, having a career basically. It was just a question of what. And when I finished high school, I thought I would become an MD. And that was because I had really seen what doctors did in terms of social interactions and things like that. And possibly also because my mother had started out to become a doctor, although she never urged me to become a doctor. But the part of it that I enjoyed was increasingly the mathematical and the research part of it. And then I had a friend at Mount Holyoke who brought home her chick embryos in bottles of alcohol, and I all of a sudden decided I really wasn't terribly interested in investigating human bodies. So I was turned more to thinking of becoming a chemist. The chemistry department at Mount Holyoke was excellent. Father knew the Miss Carr and Miss Cheryl, who were the senior professors there, and had Miss Carr had worked briefly with him in Cambridge, and also Miss Pickett, who was another chemist there, had spent a sabbatical there with him in Cambridge, and you know, he thought very well of them. And I think one of the reasons that he told me to apply to Mount Holyoke and no other place was that it was in the country, I would be nice and safe, it was somewhere where there were people who would look out for me, namely his friends in the chemistry department. He never said that, but having become a parent myself, I am quite sure that those things entered into the reason. And it was a fine choice as far as I was concerned. I made out of it what I needed, even though it had gone insane, and the course that had the most enrollment was something like something in the family, wellness in the family. It was taught by a social scientist of some kind. In any case, and the thing to do was to get an MRS degree by the time you graduated. I think of the 350 girls in my class, and at that time they were called girls, not women, maybe there were, maybe 35 of us, at a guess, who weren't concentrated on getting an MRS, but thinking of doing something else first. And so it was a mixed experience. For one thing, it, for the first time, introduced me to the concept of boys as being something other than objectionable. I had been very young in high school, and the only interaction I had was them copying my lab book, and I did not have a very high opinion of them. And well, and that it was the beginning of, you know, a broadening of my point of view on that issue. And they gave me a beautiful liberal arts education, which I treasure to this day. The fact that I know all of the things that are now being very carefully taken out of the curriculum so you can teach people something so they can get a job has been a source of great pleasure to me throughout my life. I took French, I took German, I even took Russian. I've tried 3 times to learn the Russian language, and can, with the aid of a dictionary, read at a very, very low level. But that's as far as I got. I took Latin in high school too, so I have a pretty broad background. But I've increasingly gone in the direction of physics. I mean, I went to Berkeley, and there, I think at the suggestion of my father, I got in contact with Glenn Seaborg, whom father had interacted with a lot during the war. And he took me on as a graduate student, which is in the chemistry department, but is nuclear chemistry, which is not that different from what nuclear physics was at that time. Now there's a much bigger divide between the two, but at that time they were not that different. And so that's where I got what I did my PhD work on. And you know, I used chemistry to isolate isotopes of promethium, but I wasn't interested in the chemistry, unpleasant and difficult as it was. It was finding out what the isotopes were that was the point of it. And from that, I moved on to doing nuclear scattering experiments, and then I moved on to do high energy physics experiments, and that's sort of how my career evolved.
So you are the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree.
No. Well, as you may have gathered, I thought very highly of my father. And I think he was a good, you know, he was human. He had his faults. Even I will admit that. But he was a good person to emulate.
Now he was involved a lot on a public policy basis, as involved after the war.
Yeah, that's the part that I'm writing right now, how he became, because first when he went back to Harvard, he had a hard time getting back into doing research in a university mode, rather than in this frantic, parallel, trying everything mode to get something crammed through in a hurry. And then they made him chairman of the department, and that took time for a few years. And but you know, he did pick up his research and begin to publish well again. But he also was asked from the very beginning, I think, to serve with the Air Force on an Air Force committee. And I haven't really researched the committees that he served on enough to be terribly knowledgeable about it. That's buried in the Harvard archives in his papers. And because I am not quite as functional as I used to be, I now have somebody who's going through the papers for me, and we'll see what comes of that. But I do know he did do work on jet propulsion, and I believe there was a thing called a dinosaur and some other very fancy they actually must have been rocket devices, not, no, I think they were they airplanes or were they rocket devices? It's been a long time since I've read the book on that. I will have to go back and read that. And from this, he was invited to become a member of the Science Advisory Committee to Eisenhower, which then became formally a presidential Science Advisory Committee, under Killian as chairman, and Killian was the science advisor. And then when Killian resigned after 2 years, Eisenhower asked George if he would do it, and he did. And he himself wrote a book about his year and a half with Eisenhower, because Eisenhower's term ended a year and a half after he became advisor. And during that period, his eyes were opened. He had been very patriotic. He was till the day he died. But he had always assumed that the people who were directing the country knew what they were doing and were telling the truth. And when he was working with Eisenhower, Eisenhower sent him to inspect various things that were run by the military and to check up on what was indeed the situation, and discovered discrepancies between the facts and what was really true. And it changed his view completely of how to treat the whole military establishment, rather as something that you worked with shoulder to shoulder and didn't question, but as an entity which you questioned like anything else. And after he resigned, he did go on one big, more government effort, and that was the Test Ban Treaty negotiation in Geneva. Eisenhower hadn't been able to get the nuclear tests banned because Gary Powers' plane was shot down in Russia, and that put the quietus on that. But Kennedy did push it forward, and Wiesner pushed it. Wiesner was Kennedy's advisor, and George went on to that Geneva meeting on that test ban. And he worked with a number of groups, but as I say, this is something I don't have a firm grasp on, so I can't comment on. But he became more and more disillusioned with what was going on, and at the end of the 60s, he resigned all his government-affiliated posts because he wanted to speak out against the Vietnam War, and he did not feel he could do so while he was on these government committees. And that began the period of his life that he called his peacenik period. And he helped with the early years of the Council for a Livable World. He advised Henry Kendall on the Union of Concerned Scientists and did other things. Oh, and I left out another thing. He was very, very influential in the change in the way that the Academy operated, National Academy of Sciences. He was offered the chance to become president of the Academy after the war, but Pusey had become president of Harvard, and Pusey said either George was going to be a Harvard professor and stay home and do it, or he was going to stop being a Harvard professor on leave. He was going to have to resign. And since the presidency of the Academy is a full-time job, he instead passed on that and became vice president. and ran a study of how one could reform the report system so that the reports would really be verifiable and usable. And that was carried out and resulted in the present system where Academy reports have a great deal of credibility. And, you know, to the end of his life, he was trying to end the proliferation of nuclear weapons.
Did he ever write about or tie in his own experience in contributing to our weapon? Did he have regrets about his participation?
No, I never asked him the question that I would like to know the answer to, which is, well, how do you feel now about having done that? I think that was something that he did with the best of all intentions, and he just put it behind him. I mean, he had a very rackety life. He went through some very difficult periods and some troubling times, and nearly died of typhus, and you know, he went through a lot of things, and he just put them behind himself and went on to deal with things as he thought they should be done now. And I have found that that is a very, very helpful way of operating.
Right. Can you tell us a little, I'm going to go back, circle back to your life again. Yeah. And we had you working with Seaborg at Berkeley. And then after you finished your, I guess you must have gotten your PhD there.
Yes,
as you said.
January '52.
Right. And then what happened?
Well, in June of '51, I had married another graduate student, Gerhard Emil Fischer, known as Jerry, who was the grandson of Emil Fischer, who won the second Nobel Prize in chemistry, and the son of Hermann Fischer, who was an internationally known biochemist. And we got an apartment in Berkeley. And when I got my PhD, I first had a research fellowship with Seaborg for half a year, and then I got a job with U.S. Naval Research Laboratory in San Francisco. And the reason I did was that as long as I was working for Seaborg, Jerry couldn't get paid at the radiation lab. They had a nepotism rule. But once I was not working there, then he could have a paid research fellowship at the rad lab. So that happened. And I went over to the Navy lab, intending to carry out my mission, which was to set up a counting facility, because they were going to be getting radioactive waste from atomic tests in the Pacific. And, you know, that was fun. Putting together a whole bunch of detectors would be fun, and I could experiment with the new sodium iodide crystal methods that had just come into operation. So, you know, it didn't sound like a bad job. And I discovered that there were some distinct drawbacks to being employed by the Navy. When they got the battleship washings, it was all hands on deck now to take care of this. And forget about setting up your equipment. You're a chemist, you analyze battleship washings. And boy, first of all, I was furious, and second of all, it was not the kind of thing that I enjoyed doing. You know, batch analysis, like that. And I would say that by the time I had managed to get myself a fellowship, and the American Association of University Women came to my rescue and gave me a Sarah Berliner Fellowship so that I could go back to the Rad Lab and do research. And I said goodbye to my very highly paid job at NERDL. They paid me $9,000 a year. The fellowship was $2,000. Boy, it was worth $1 million to have that fellowship. And Alvarez took me on as a postdoc so that I was formally in the physics department, which made my access to some of the things that I needed, like the linear accelerator on the Hill, a little smoother. And also was useful because Alvarez, although I didn't see much of him, was, you know, a very sharp man and interesting, even if you only saw him occasionally.
So this is Luis Alvarez, who was on the Manhattan Project as well.
Alvarez, yeah.
Yes. Had you known him, or did your father talk about him at Los Alamos? Or did you know
I was not very cognizant of the people who were at Los Alamos. He's not somebody that comes to mind. I mean, there are other people. I mean, I remember the Hornigs very well, both Lily and Don. And I remember Henry Lynchitz, and who worked for Father also. But I was not into people at that time. I was into horses.
That's good.
So anyway, I had my fellowship with Alvarez. Jerry finished his PhD, and we looked for jobs and ended up at Columbia. He was instructor in the chemistry department, in the physics department, and I was a research fellow in the chemistry department with a nuclear chemist there. He was a really nice guy. He let me do what I wanted to. And I wandered over and I got to know Shen-Sheng Wu and the other nuclear chemists. And at the end of the first year at Columbia, my position was formally shifted over to, actually no, I had first been sent over to her to help her with the chemical ends of her work. That was that. But you know, she supported me, and others supported me on becoming a research associate in the physics department rather than the chemistry department. So that's how I made my switch from official switch from chemistry to physics. And I started doing scattering experiments at Brookhaven National Laboratory, and then you don't want to hear the story of my life.
Well, you know, one of the things everyone is interested in is women in science. And there's a lot of young women who, you know, may be inspired by your story. You know, you can give a broad brush rather than every blow by blow, but I think it's very interesting.
Yeah. Well, what happened next was that Jerry did not get an advancement. Basically, was told to go. And so he found a job at the Cambridge Electron Accelerator in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And at that point, I was pregnant. And I said I wanted to stay at Columbia because I had been told I had a future at Columbia, that I could get a position, not at Columbia, but at Barnard. They would hire me as an assistant professor there. But I could continue to do the research at Columbia. So I wanted to stay in New York, and my father joined Jerry in a chorus of protest at the idea that I should stay in New York by myself. You know, I'd had puppies, and I figured a baby couldn't be that much more trouble than a puppy. Little did I know. So, you know, and they were right. It would have been very hard to manage by myself in New York. So, very grumpily, I applied for an assistant professorship at Brandeis, and in spite of the unenthusiastic way that I viewed the opportunity, it was offered to me, and I became an assistant professor at Brandeis. And not immediately, and Mark was born in July 3rd, and in September I assumed my assistant professorship at Brandeis. And then Karin was born 2 years later, roughly on June 16th. And subsequently, we had first lived in Waban, which was sort of halfway between Brandeis and Cambridge, where Jerry worked. And he really wanted to be closer to work so that he could go back at night. He was a workaholic. So we moved into Cambridge, and I got a job at MIT with a group that I had already been doing research with. I had been doing it at Brandeis, but we were collaborating. And I had been offered this job at MIT anytime I wanted it. So I got the research scientist position at MIT. And that was that for a while. And then Jerry and I split up. He wasn't happy at the Cambridge Electron Accelerator, and it was clear to me that he should move. I mean, he should go somewhere else. I really didn't want to go somewhere else, and you know, there were other reasons, but basically he went to California and the kids and I didn't. And I discovered that it's very interesting to be a mother with 2 small children. But I had the advantage of a well-paid job and a father who helped, and a wonderful stepmother. My father and Irma divorced, and he had remarried, and his present wife is Elaine, who has just, they couldn't have had a better grandmother. And at MIT, I eventually became a senior research scientist. This was doing now bubble chamber experiments, and then it evolved into doing particle experiments with other kinds of detectors. And then finally, I was put up for professor, and I was voted in by the department, and I was called to a meeting with the chairman of the department, and a colleague warned me I should go in prepared for bad news, and I couldn't figure out what that was, but what it was that your charming physicist from Vienna, who was the chairman of the department then, and I'll come up with his name in a minute. Come on. You wrote the quantum mechanics book. Weisskopf couldn't be the first man to appoint a woman to the physics department. And I was sort of flabbergasted. And I said, well, I guess then I will have to look for another job. And he said, oh, no, 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 you mustn't do that, because affirmative action had come into place. And all of a sudden, he realized that the person who had pushed it, who was Wiesner, Jerry Wiesner, brought his affirmative action to MIT long before there was government affirmative action, thanks to Leo Wiesner, who was a mathematician. Well, also thanks, I'm sure, to his own common sense. So after a few days, I was told that I was offered a position as assistant, was it provost, assistant dean or something, to a very nice guy whose name I can't remember at the moment, and I won't be able to come up with it, so you'll have to forgive me. But, you know, a man that I had known from other interactions, committees or whatever. And I was to work as an aide to him, as a scientific aide to him. And so one day he slid across my desk a document that was the affirmative action statement for the mathematics department. This now was for the government affirmative action that this was prepared. And I took it and I read it, and I said, this reads like nonsense. I don't believe it. And I took it to my friend Vera Pless, who was a mathematician, and I said, what do you make of this? And she said, this statement is false. I know this woman is looking for a job, and it says here that she isn't. This statement is false. It says that there are no women qualified in this particular area, and so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so are. And she tore the thing apart, and I made marginal notes on all of these comments, and then I did the thing that I should be ashamed of. Instead of bringing them to my good friend whose assistant I was, I sent one copy to Wiesner and the other copy of what I had done to the head of the mathematics department. And if you'll excuse me, the shit hit the fan. And I was made full professor, retroactive to the beginning of the summer. I would never have made a very good administrator.
Wow. That's quite a story.
Mm-hmm.
Goodness.
And, you know, I did other things. I organized a committee of women, Committee on Women for the American Physical Society. A friend had organized Faye Eisenberg-Selov had organized a session at the APS on women in science, and some of the remarks from the audience were egregious. Usually these people from Austria. There was another Austrian who came up with, oh, Maria would never have won the Nobel Prize if she hadn't been married to Pierre. Yeah, sure. Anyway, so we had a committee and worked very hard on it for a year and put together a report. Another comment I'd had, well, I have a committee on women. There are only 3 of them, and I know all of them. he didn't mean me. He meant Chen Xiang-Wu and the Goldhaber's wife, Shulamith Goldhaber, and one other woman that I can't think of at the moment. And we found that there were 450 PhD women physicists in the United States. There certainly were more, but that's the number that we came up with. And the committee still exists in a slightly different mode. It doesn't do these surveys, it does other things. And then I worked with the National Research Council on Women in Science and Engineering. And I've done a lot of talking on it, like giving lectures. And following that, my father was becoming ill with cancer. And also there was first the registration for the draft, and then the Vietnam War, not the Vietnam War, then the, what was it? Registration for the draft. Oh, Reagan and the Strategic Defense Initiative. A total insane waste of money. You know, it has resulted in one good thing. The Israelis have been able to shoot down those short-range missiles. Much as I disapprove of the Israeli conduct, at least there is this one bright spot in that conflict, that all these billions of dollars that the United States spent has resulted in one thing that works. Albeit not a protective dome over anything. So anyway, since my father was hors de combat, I decided that I would work on nuclear issues, particularly on the Strategic Defense Initiative, and spent a year boning up, and then went around giving talks on that.